Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Spirit of the Light Virtual Church and our Christianity 101 class, our beginners Bible study class. We're on the books of the Bible and we're in the New Testament right now. As we discussed before, the New Testament is split into 5 sections. The 4th section of the New Testament is called the General Epistles, or the General Epistles, be another name. And these include the books of Hebrews, James, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and Jude. Hebrews is kind of a different color, kind of like we discussed last week. Some people associate to put the Hebrews with Paul and put it under the epistles of Paul, and some don't, and they put it in the general letters or general epistles category. We discussed in prior weeks the 4 Gospels. Those events happened between 6 AD and 30 AD. The Acts of the Apostles, that section, which is include Acts, is the events happened from 30 to 62 AD, and the epistles of Paul was between those events, in those letters, 51 to 67. Now, the events of the general letters are from 45 through 95, which eclipse all of Paul's letters and also cover some of the time period of the Acts of the Apostles. General letters. General letters differ from Paul's letters because they don't have a direct audience, with the exception of 2nd and 3rd John. As the Paul letters were written to a specific group, like the Romans or the Galatians, the general letters were a broadcast letter that were for all Christians and not for one specific church or one specific person. The letters are grouped from the longest to the shortest, but they are subgrouped by the authors. So like John is 1, 2, 3 John, Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter. But in each of those subgroups, the longest letters are first and the shortest letters are last. And the author of Hebrews is debated. It's more than not known as use the word debated. Some attribute it to Paul, but those who don't attribute the letter to Paul, they say that the language and the format are different from the other letters that Paul. So that's where the discrepancy come in. Most of Paul's letters have a very distinct format and very distinct language that's used, but Hebrews differs from that. So that's where the debate comes in as to where Hebrews actually sits. Now, the writers of the general letters were all close to Jesus Christ. John and Peter was in his inner circle, and this inner circle was made up of Peter, James, and John. And Jude and James, the other writers of the general letters, were Jesus's brothers. If you recall, neither Jude or James were disciples of Jesus during Jesus's ministry, but they became um, strong followers of Christ after his death. James, so much so that he was the first bishop of the church in Jerusalem. Two major principles that underlie the variety of items treated in these letters are one, that we can trust God to provide for us, and that we must work for the benefit of others in need. So these are two of the major things that's carried out in the bulk of the general letters. And as a comparison between the epistles and the gospels, the gospels were written to non-believers as to where the epistles were written to actual saved believers who believed in Christianity. Gospels focuses on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, while the epistles focuses on the establishing the church. The Gospels discuss the personas or the basis of Jesus Christ, as to where the epistles discuss more doctrines, theological points, and the development of the church. Gospels focus on the testimony of Jesus Christ, as to where the general letters and the epistles focuses on the theme of salvation. The book of Revelation is the last section or the fifth section of the New Testament, and it's only one book, which is Revelation. And here's our timeline to come back to it. And the book of Revelation is roughly around 95 AD. I'm not going to get deeply into the book here when we talk about the specific books. We'll talk more about what's in Revelation. It's written by John, not John the Baptist, but John, who was the disciple and then the apostle of Jesus Christ. And he also wrote the book of John and the four Gospels and first, second, and third John and the general letters section of the New Testament. The book of Revelation is the book of prophecy. It foretells the New Testament and future prophecy, God's people or followers to find encouragement in. We discuss it more when we talk about the individual books, but it involves a vision of John's heaven that gives us details about the last days, which is also called eschatology. Okay, now to get into the specific books. The first section of the New Testament is the four Gospels, and they are four books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as we discussed last week. So let's talk about the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew is the first book in the section of the four Gospels. And I kind of wanted to talk about this, although this is a little involved for new believers. but I was trying to create a timeline on when the four gospels were written, and it's a very broad time spectrum, and it's based on what theory you believe on the development of the four books. One theory places the books sooner than some of the other theories do. So I just wanted to talk about the four theories of how the four gospels were developed before we get into the book of Matthew itself. The first one is called the primitive gospel theory, which is just that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written using material from a more primitive gospel that was not preserved. There's very little historical support for this specific theory. Then there's the oral tradition theory, where the Gospels are based on material that was orally passed along before it was actually written down. Bronson, you have your hand up. You're on mute. You're on mute. You're, can't quite hear you.
Could you explain to everyone what oral tradition is?
Well, oral tradition, although she can explain it probably better than I, is how the Jews passed along information from generation to generation. Although books were eventually written down, a lot of the information was passed by mouth. One person passed the information to their kids and their generation, and then that generation spoke and passed that information down. So that's what is meant by oral tradition. The traditions of the Jews and all that information was vocalized from one generation to the next. It wasn't transcribed and written down until much a later time. Well, Rosalind, did I cover that well?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there is some truth to this. Some of the New Testament information was passed on, but that does not account for some of the earlier written accounts or variation in forms or content, etc., at a very advanced time, unlike the Old Testament wasn't necessarily written for years. There wasn't a large gap of time between when the events happened to when they were actually written down. But some of the information was orally passed on. And this is the first of the two most major theories, the Markan priority, which is the most accepted theory now, which is that Mark gospel was written first, and Matthew was written from Mark, and there was another document that was also used to write Matthew, and then Luke was written based on Mark, and there was another set of documents that Luke used that Mark didn't use to include the other details that aren't in Mark. So you will hear things like the documents M for Mark or L for Luke, or this huge document that was a document of manuscript outside of Mark that both Matthew and Luke pull information from. So this is what today's scholar believe the development of the for the Gospels are that Mark was first, Matthew and Luke was based on Mark, but Matthew and Luke also has other information that they pull from to complete the development of their books. Everybody believed that John's was last, so that's not a something that is debated. Then there's the Matthean priority. That Matthew was the first book, which was written, and then Luke was written based on Matthew, and then Mark wrote his book based on both Matthew and Luke. Now, all of the accounts of the early church writers, this is what they documented as what the progression of the Gospels were. And it accounts for the literary relationship that exists between the Gospels and doesn't have hypothetical documents that were used. Rosalind, you have your hand up.
What you've done, are you finished?
Yes, I'm done.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to add my spin on it. This information is good to have so you can understand other people when they try to teach it. But I don't think it's critical, and I don't think any of it's right. I personally think that they took notes. Why write another book saying the same thing as somebody else's if you have your own notes? But oral tradition, I think, is the weakest argument because there was too much detail and it was too accurate to have been passed down by word of mouth from person to person. And the others, I mean, why would they all use a source book and write the same book? It just doesn't make sense to me. But we all know that they saw things a little differently, but they saw them together. So I'm just saying, new believers, please don't get hung up on that. New students, please don't get hung up on that. It's just some good information to know, but it won't save you or kill you. How about that?
Yeah, Rob is correct. This is just some background information that I wanted to share. Like I said, because I could not positively give a timeline for when these books was written, so I figured it was good to kind of explain how different people view it. Janine, yeah, your hand up.
Well, actually, it's me.
It's done,
Um,
man.
yeah, I agree with Rosalind that we can nitpick this, but the nitpicking can be a real distraction, and then that makes everything counterproductive.
All right, well, thank you for your feedback, Ross and Doug. I think we have some future teachers for some some of this course. Okay.
I thought I was co-teaching, but I guess not. Okay. All right. Sorry, y'all. Oh.
It's all stuff, Mom. I'm picking on you. Okay, let's look at the book of Matthew. Okay, it's again up there in the air when the book was written, but they kind of have it penciled down to a date range between 58 and 69 AD. Now, Matthew was a Jew and one of the disciples of Jesus Christ. And Matthew wrote his book to a Jewish Christian audience. It's again, like we said from the previous slide, it's widely accepted that Mark used information from the book of Mark plus other material. But like I said, the early fathers of the church, the first generation of church leaders after the disciples passed on, all felt that Matthew was actually the first book that was written. Now, Matthew in this book does not attempt to give a historical perspective of what happened during the time of Jesus, but a theological biography. Matthew begins the book with a genealogy of Jesus, and Jesus being the rightful heir to King David. Thus, he presents Jesus as the King of the Jews. Matthew also notes in the beginning of his book the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies about Jesus from Isaiah, Micah, and Hosea. Matthew demonstrates God's work in Jesus to fulfill his promises to his chosen people who were the Jew. But he also goes on to show how God offers the same blessing and judgments to all of humanity. Christian living means obeying God. It means to follow Jesus in discipleship and obey his commandments. Christ did not come to abolish the Old Testament, but the law can be rightly applied in a beginner's life only after one understands how it is fulfilled in Jesus. And Matthew is the only gospel writer that uses the word church in his writing. Of the four gospels. That moves us to the book of Mark, the second book of the four gospels. Mark, or John Mark, was not an original disciple of Jesus Christ himself. His mother hosted a Jerusalem house church, and Mark also ministered with Barnabas, Paul, and Peter. This highlights his exposure to the gospel into the life of Jesus Christ. Now, Mark also journeyed with Paul, the Apostle Paul, for a while. They became separated due to a conflict, and Barnabas decided to go with his cousin Mark instead of continuing on with Paul. So this just shows how God works. God used whatever conflict, because the Bible is not specific to what the conflict between Mark and Paul was, but they both went on to do powerful things in God's word. And it allowed the gospel to spread even faster because more people were out there spreading it. So, sometimes we have different callings in our lives and we'll be put apart to do separate things. But because of that, God's kingdom will continue to grow and might even grow faster due to the multiple separate efforts that people do. So Mark must have been, he was a God-filled, spirit-filled person, considering the beautiful writing he did with this book. A lot of his information about Jesus was from Peter, and he wrote the book of Mark when he was in Rome. Mark wrote to the Gentile church in Rome and was, again, some people, the foundation of the books of Matthew and Luke. Now, I like Matthew, who started with Jesus's bloodline, and in the very beginning, Mark begins his book with Jesus' encounter with John the Baptist, which was kind of the kickstart to Jesus's ministry.
Sure, that was Mark and not Paul?
Paul started with,
I mean, not Paul, John.
no, John didn't start with John the Baptist. John started
Started
with,
within the beginning, that's right.
yes. Now, Mark's major theme was about this discipleship. He recognized that the discipleship with Jesus was costly, often led to persecution, and that at times the disciples did not understand what Jesus was trying to teach them, and at times the disciples even failed. But through all of this, there was still hope. And Mark also wrote of a future beyond Jesus' human life and the promises that were to come. What Mark wanted us to do was to recognize our duty, which is the same of what the disciples were, which is to bear witness to the gospel of Jesus. So it's 6:29, and we're right on track here. So this is our information. If you wish to reach out to us to receive more information about what we're doing, our internet, Facebook, YouTube, phone number, and address. So as a group, as we're here with my wife, Assistant Pastor Roz, our senior advisor and father, Willie McCrory, and I think Minister Doug is the one who's with us right now, or his wife Jadine, or both of them together. Thank you for spending time with us this evening. Look us up for the other events this week, and we will continue with the books of the New Testament next Monday, same time, 6 o'clock Pacific time.